What happens in the sky affects life down here on Earth. The Celestial Compass shows you how and guides your way with astrology you can use from professional astrologer Kathy Beal. Every episode features her light-hearted, practical forecasts and navigational tips, blended with humor, optimism, and a love of patterns, symbolism, and pop culture references. Kathy translates technicalities into concepts that apply to real life. You'll learn how the current moment ties to where we've been, from the recent past to cycles that last happened years ago, and get a look at where we're heading. And much more, from special topics to special guests. The Celestial Compass, enlightening, entertaining, and empowering. Here's your host, Kathy Beal.
Greetings, Earthlings. This is Kathy Beal, host of Celestial Compass, with a special Mercury retrograde blessed solstice edition of the show. A very quick forecast before we talk to our very special guest. Just a quick update. We have entered into Cancer season. This week will be much more tender and emotional and perhaps needy than the last few weeks have been. And there is a full moon in Capricorn coming this week at the end of the week on the 24th that will bring our attention back down to matters here on Earth. And yet it is somewhat unhinged because it has a luscious link to Jupiter in Pisces. Just know that the last 2 weeks of the month are a time to dream, to allow yourself to take some time off, to imagine how your life could be more satisfying, and to bring personal meaning into the goals that you are setting for yourself. Short and sweet. Also, Mercury is going to turn direct, thank God. And with that, we're going to turn to everybody's favorite topic, relationships. And I am thrilled to be meeting an astrologer whose work I have been following for some time, Margaret Gray of Ireland. She's an international consulting and teaching psychological astrologer and psychotherapist based in Dublin, Ireland. She offers birth chart readings to individuals, couples, and children, as well as certificate courses in psychological and relationship astrology. Margaret is the co-founder and co-director of Relationships and Astrology. She also set up and co-runs Astrology Ireland, which offers monthly presentations and classes with local and international speakers. Margaret is on the board of AIEA. She presents regularly at international astrology conferences. So welcome, Margaret.
Oh, thank you, Kathy. It's so lovely to be here with you.
It's great to hear your voice directly. I have watched your videos many times. Could you tell us, please, how you got into astrology?
I'd be delighted to. You know, I started many years ago before we really had astrology computer programs, so I had to learn how to draw up charts on my own. And I often tell people this, I'm pretty awful at maths, and so when I finally got an old Amstrad computer with a program on it, I realized a lot of my calculations were wrong. Which was kind of a real lesson in ego, really. But I loved doing it, and I discovered later that my aunt actually in Italy was also an astrologer and did tarot. She was in her 70s, 80s already at the time. And then I noticed there was an evening class. I was in Bristol at the time, living in the UK, and I noticed an evening class in psychological astrology, and I went along, and I just loved it. It was like coming home, really. And I studied with that teacher for about 6 years, and then she said she's taught us everything she could, which was once a week for like 6 years. And then I started studying at the CPA in London. I got my diploma there with Liz Green and Melanie Reinhardt and so on. So that was really my introduction. I mean, what inspired me was that I had a few readings myself, both individual and relationship readings. And I just thought it was fascinating. You know, it made perfect sense to me. So that was really my journey into astrology.
And what drew you into blending astrology with the vast issue of relationships?
Well, really, to put it quite bluntly, because my relationships haven't done so great in my lifetime, I think everybody has challenges in relationships, but it was really trying to figure out for myself what was going on in my relationships. And I think because, well, first of all, I've got Venus in the seventh house and Mercury there as well. So I suppose part of my role kind of as a bridge and trying to understand relationships comes from my chart. And really everything is about relationships. They're key to our human existence. As soon as we step out our door and we even go to the store to buy something, we are in relationship with other people. When we're driving along, we are in relationship with the other drivers. And I've always been fascinated by how we recreate the same patterns over and over and over in order to try and heal ourselves. And as a psychotherapist, I do a lot of work now with couples, but I also was a social worker at one point and worked a lot with children and families, and astrology was incredibly helpful to make sense of what was going on when sometimes, there were no other tools, there were very few other tools to really try and get a handle on what the dynamics were about.
That makes absolute sense. I have certainly found that by looking at the charts of two people who are involved in a situation, you can see how they approach life and ways in which their approach is different than the other approach. And I always look at it as if you're screaming in Russian at somebody who speaks Spanish, the louder you scream, it's not going to get through to them. So if you understand how they actually process information, you can attempt to convey it to them in a way that's going to have meaning to them.
Well, absolutely. And I think the wonderful thing, one of the many wonderful things about relationship astrology is that it depersonalizes why we react as we do. And it really helps us to understand why we get triggered by certain people or certain situations. And that means that we can take ownership of those triggers and work with them rather than project our kind of fears, our concerns, our past history onto somebody else and then say they are doing this to me. So I think, relationships are the greatest mirror we have in our life. They really help us to understand ourselves as we know well. And I think it's so easy for us to then blame the other person when we're going through changes within ourselves. And astrology gives us that map, that tool to really realize how is this about me and what is it about me? And, we can't change somebody else, of course, but we can certainly change ourselves. And so when we start realizing, goodness, I keep getting triggered when people do this or whatever, then we start realizing, okay, this is my pattern. This is something within me. And what can I do to change myself? And I think that's one of the beauties of relationship astrology. I think that it's practical. It's really about how we live our lives in a way that's more conducive for us to be happy individually and in relationship with others. So it's a very practical tool. It's not, pie in the sky in terms of just theory or philosophy.
Oh, I agree absolutely. I'm curious, are there particular factors that you have found to be important, or is it really just on a case-by-case basis? In other words, if a couple comes to you, do you have places that you normally start in how you approach things?
Absolutely. I'm a great lover of attachment theory, so I always go to the moon. I really think that so much of our interactions and the issues that come up in couples and also within family members, even with friendships, even sometimes in work situations, go back to the basics of attachment theory and the moon. Because if we're not familiar with what gives us comfort, with what soothes us, with what, how we nurture ourselves, then I think those needs come up so loud in our relationships and we're not even aware of what's happening. Often they're unconscious because it's so easy to be unconscious about the moon. So I always look at the moon and I look at, are the moons how do the moons relate to each other between these two individuals? Are they in signs that are more compatible, like, say, fire and air and earth and water, or are they in signs that we have to create more bridges between them? It doesn't mean that there's a lack of compatibility, but it just means we have to work a little bit more. And the other thing, that the other planet that goes alongside that is Mercury, because to me it's critical how we communicate. And if one person has Mercury in fire, excuse me, and the other person has a Mercury in water, they're two very different styles of communicating, because the Mercury in fire will talk usually give a lot of information, will talk quickly and may not actually remember even what they've said. Words come out easily, they flow. For a Mercury in water person, particularly if they're in a situation where they're feeling emotionally distressed, words can literally freeze, and so the person cannot utter anything, and it's much easier for them to write than to speak. So even understanding that can help the Mercury and fire person know that their significant other isn't being silent because they've nothing to say. They're being silent because the words are not coming out and they need some time to process. I mean, similarly for Mercury in earth also needs a little bit of time to process things, and Mercury in earth is quite concrete and needs concrete examples, whereas the Mercury in air has a lot of ideas, and they can be very much intellectual concepts. But for the Mercury in earth person, they need it explained in a much more practical, real way. So to me, those two planets are actually a lot more important than Venus and Mars. I think we pay a lot of attention to Venus and Mars, but I always look at Mercury and the moon, because if there is, how do we create some bridges between those, or how do we even to explain to clients, this is what's going on? There's a huge difference. Now, the other thing is also, of course, the elemental balance. If one chart is very airy and the other chart, for example, is very watery, that's the typical scenario where you get one person saying, my partner is cold and detached, and the person with a lot of air is saying, my partner is highly emotional and oversensitive. And the terms used get very derogatory because it's unfamiliar. And just to explain to people, look, this is how you both operate, and both are equally valuable, they're just different, I think can bring about immediately some kind of sense of relief that, I'm not doing something wrong, and just a greater understanding. So much of relationship conflicts are about misunderstandings. They're not about a lack of love. I mean, if the love isn't there, people don't stay together. But if people stay together, usually there is love, and it's really more about tweaking things and finding bridges so that they can connect in a way that really works, better for both of them.
I have found that if you understand how somebody takes in and processes information, it can actually really, really help, because the Mercury differences have been key in numerous business partnerships of mine falling apart, with people with a water Mercury really taking things personally and deciding to read all kinds of stuff into I toss stuff off. I have an air Mercury, and I can be very 1, 2, 3, blam, I'm off to something else, and the water person is sitting there going, I don't feel valued.
Yeah.
So there are a couple different ways, right? So we have different positions, different placements in the chart that can end up being very, very useful. I actually chart out 7 different areas of relationship: your drive, what you value, communication style, your emotional needs, your attitude towards responsibility and commitment. It's pretty easy to see what planets are behind that, and then look for where the gaps are, where the real discrepancies are. But so one way of doing this for people who have not actually explored this very far would be comparing the charts of the two individuals in the relationship, which is what you have actually been talking about at this point.
Absolutely, the synastry, yes. Well, the comparison of both, and then the synastry, the overlay of one on top of the other, yes.
And the synastry would show where somebody's placements fall in the other person's chart.
Yes,
Like
absolutely. I describe it often as, those old negatives from cameras. You kind of put two negatives on top of each other. Those old, probably younger listeners may not even have seen them, but those old cameras where there was a film in them. And it's like putting one on top of the other and looking at the overlay. Where are the connections? Where are the things they have in common? But just to go back a second, Kathy, to,
Sure,
when we were
please.
talking about the individual charts, I think absolutely you mentioned different areas. Obviously, what's also very important is the seventh house in terms of what planets do we have there, because that's something that often we look for in somebody else in order to own them for ourselves. So we very easily project those planets onto other people. So if somebody, for example, has particularly the transpersonal planets Pluto or Uranus in the seventh house, it's very easy to project that and say, I choose partners who like a lot of space in relationships, when actually that's the individual's Uranus, that is actually their need for space. So they probably are very likely unconsciously, if they're not conscious about it, to choose partners who will give them space, because that's the need. The other thing is, of course, the eighth house, the house of intimacy, and the fifth house also to look at in terms of when we meet people. So really what both you and I were talking about was really that the first thing to look at always with relationship astrology is the individual chart. So what are my needs in a relationship? What are the kind of things that really are critical? So what are the deal breakers? So for somebody with a lot of water in their chart, they're likely to need a partner, we're talking here about intimate partner, who has a level of empathy and compassion that kind of really connects with their water chart. It doesn't mean the other person's chart has to have a lot of water, but just enough to connect. And similarly for somebody who has a lot of air, that they're going to really ideally need somebody who has some air in their chart, that there's that intellectual connection, and not intellectual in terms of having high IQ, but communication that's based on ideas and ideals. So the first starting point is always the individual chart and what's going on for you as an individual, and also what's going on in terms of transits at
Right.
this moment in time. What's been woken up for you? Because, certainly during midlife transits, relationships go through a lot of changes when one or other of the couple is going through midlife transits, particularly the Uranus opposition, which requires so much freedom.
And that's the time that a lot of people associate with getting a convertible, having an affair, doing something wild with your hair, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's what all the movies are made about, isn't it? Where you see one person riding off into the sunset and leaving everything behind.
One thing, so if you're looking at the individual chart, a lot of people I have found freak out if they see their chart and they see that the seventh house is empty. And very frequently people say, does this mean I'll never get married? So to explain to people, there's still information in your seventh house, whether there's a planet in there or not.
Well, in fact, my thinking on it is actually it means that you there's more freedom in relationships, because I see how I interpret the busy house of the chart is that they are life lessons that we come back to time and time again. So if somebody has a very busy seventh house, relationships are going to require a lot of work in this lifetime, because there's a lot of lessons to learn, which means that we have to go through unpeeling all those layers. Whereas if there are no planets there's a lot of freedom. So in fact, I would really go as far as saying it's probably a little easier if you don't have planets there. You've got much more choice and maybe a little less work to do than if you have a lot of planets, particularly transpersonal planets in the seventh house. Would you agree, Kathy? Would that be your take on it too?
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I have not considered it that way, and it makes absolute sense to me. I would agree. Yes. But what I normally do is look at two things: what's going on with the ruler of the seventh house, like where is it? How is it aspected? Because that gives you information. And to me, I see that pulls in other areas of life that are going to have something to do with how you experience or define relationships. And then I also look at transits through the seventh. That will wake up stuff, start things, cause things to happen. So, by all means, an empty seventh house in no way means, no, you're not going to have people in your life. Oh, no, you will. It'll just be different than others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also progressions going through the seventh. So there's always something going on in the chart. I mean, it's really it's just whether there's something natal, or as you say, the ruler, and what's going on with the ruler. So there's always so much going on. And particularly with relationship astrology, I don't know if you find this, but there's a lot of moving pieces to put together. And then it's really about how to put it all together and really make sure that the important things stand out. So what are the repeating themes? What are the key things to look at the moment? Where is our attention drawn to right now? Which, of course, brings us to synastry, which, sorry, I kind of went back a step. I know we've started talking about synastry, but that's really kind of the next step, really, is then looking at, once we've looked at the individual charts, and that's why I really love being able to do individual readings with people first about their relationship and then bring them together. It's not always feasible. It's a little more expensive. Sometimes people come just for one long session or 1.5 sessions. But certainly the next piece is looking at the synastry, which is, what is the overlap? So what does my chart trigger off in your chart and vice versa? And that's fascinating because there are always a lot of connections, and particularly looking at family charts, I've had the great kind of honor, I would say, really, of having several families over the years that have really been able to provide their kind of charts over a period of time, grandparents and parents and children and grandchildren. And it's fascinating to see the patterns that evolve in families and the connections and the repeating patterns that different families have. And also with important relationships in our lives, both, significant other romantic relationships or friendships, there are always very strong connections, and often connections to the nodes as well. And I think there's sometimes what I've read in various cookbooks over the years, or on whatever online, is that often people make assumptions that, for example, a moon-sun connection between people is great. And I think we have to be very careful of that, because again, we have to go back to the natal chart. What is that moon like for that individual? What was their relationship with their mother like? What was their experience of nurturing like? Because the other person's sun is going to shine a really bright light on their moon. And if somebody has moon in a complex placement, or they've had a challenging relationship with their mother and they've struggled with nurturing, somebody's sun and that moon may not feel so comfortable. And
but it might feel familiar. It might feel like what they know, right?
Absolutely, but it may not be easy, and it may not be something that they want to have a relationship with somebody who does that throughout their lifetime. And it depends, again, how much work they've done on their moon. So the synastry from one person's chart to the other depends on how much work each individual has done on the planets that are aspected. If somebody has very low self-esteem and somebody's planet lights up their Venus, it may not feel very easy, and they may not be ready or willing to do the work required to work on their Venus at that point, which is why the foundation work of working on the individual chart, knowing where somebody's at, how conscious they are of their planets, really, I think, makes a huge difference. And why we can't just, I would suggest to people, be careful when you look up your synastry aspects online. You say, oh, that's a great aspect, or that's an awful aspect. Like, for example, Saturn aspects, intra aspects are considered difficult, but actually, to me, they really can help the relationship manifest, and the relationship really can give it enormous continuity to really have, for example, a Saturn-Sun synastry intra aspects. What do you think, Kathy?
I say Saturn is the glue, all right?
Exactly.
When I see strong Saturn links, I go, you're not getting out of this one. Not easily.
Yes.
It's with you.
Yes. Which sometimes can be challenging, of course, when a couple are trying to break up, and the Saturn, that sense of duty, also connects without necessarily the love being there anymore.
Well, that's very true. And this brings up an important aspect of astrology, which is all of these influences exist on a spectrum of expression. And usually a chart will say something multiple times pushing the expression in a certain way. So reading a cookbook, reading a this aspect means this approach is a very not always helpful because you don't see, all right, I've got 5 things saying I really have to deal with commitment issues. You know,
Absolutely, I totally
yeah.
agree. Yes, yes. That's exactly what you said. It's the themes, it's the recurring themes, and I think that's the work with relationship astrology. It's the work with all astrology, but particularly with relationship astrology. You know, I don't know about you, but I end up with so many charts. I usually use the floor to put them all on to look at the patterns and the interconnections. Because there's a lot, you know, and then we synthesize it all, of course, for the client, but behind the scenes, there are a lot of these moving pieces and the transits that are going on for each individual, as we mentioned, not to mention, of course, the composite chart and the transits, the composite chart and all of those good things. So there really is a lot that goes into it in order to extract what you said, the core themes that repeat over and over.
And after a certain age, I have found it's common to just find yourself going again when something happens, and that's usually a hint that look at your own chart. That's where the answer is.
Absolutely, yes,
Now,
absolutely.
you have said a word that is something we have not defined yet. You said composite chart. I say composite. It's the same thing, which is the chart of the halfway points or the midpoints or the chart of the relationship.
Yes, I love working with the composite chart. That's my Irish accent there.
That's fine.
But
Good.
I love it because I think it's a fascinating chart, and I look at the sun in the composite chart as the purpose of the relationship, and the purpose in terms of, I really, when I do psychological astrology, I think of psyche as in soul, and so I'm really looking at it in terms of the soul purpose, and I don't mean it in a religious way, more of in a spiritual way of why are we on this planet, what are we here to do, and to me the composite chart, the position of the sun, the sign, the aspects, the house, really gives so much information about what is the purpose of this relationship. And I believe all relationships have a greater purpose. It's not just about being with somebody, for ourselves. It's also what does this dyad offer the world, or what does this triad offer the world at large. And so it's a very powerful chart, and it has a life of its own. And I personally use the midpoint composite chart. I know some people use the Davison chart, but having tried out the two, for me, the composite, midpoint composite works best. And I just find it's an amazing tool. It's much more concrete than the natal chart. I remember, I think it was Liz Green years ago said, you can't take the composite chart itself to therapy. Of course, you can take the couple to therapy, but not the chart. And I think it's much more, for me as a psychological astrologer, it's looking at it as something that is more concrete and literal. So that, if Venus is in the 5th house, we're looking at what is the pleasure in that house. It's just less layered in some ways, which makes it easier to look at. And the transits are fascinating because, again, they are quite literal. So whereas if there is a transit on, an angle of a natal chart, there can be a lot of multiple interpretations of that, of course. When it's on a composite chart, usually there is more of a literal expression of it. It's like we don't experience it internally as much as we do externally. So it can be very good in terms of looking at changes. And, of course, then we can look at the synastry of each individual chart with the composite chart to see which person, and again, we're talking about partnerships here, which person in that relationship is more aligned with the composite chart and who might end up living out more of the composite chart. Now, the composite chart also I find is fascinating because it often has more of an element. Maybe if, say, for example, two people have an element missing between them, say one person has maybe both people have, for example, a lack of air. Often the composite will suddenly have a lot of air in it. So it teaches couple as well how to integrate elements that are missing often, or how to integrate things that maybe they are struggling with as individuals. And that's really a very big learning experience, because the composite can be so different for both individuals. And so, it's where people often say, we met and we got on really well, and then as we maybe decided to live together or commit to each other, then all hell broke loose. And that's because the composite chart came into play. And the composite takes a little while to come into effect. It's not like the synastry. The synastry is immediate. We meet somebody, we feel their energy, literally their planetary energy, and we either go towards them or we go away from them. But with the composite chart, that forms over time. And so issues can come up that we think, why was everything okay? Why were we communicating so well? Now we're struggling with our communication. And so explaining the composite chart to a couple can really, really help them, I think, to understand that together they formed this third entity, which is, extraordinary, really, and is part of both of them, but it is something separate as well. And so they need to nurture, understand, and create bridges between their own natal chart and the composite chart.
And I think it's fascinating how differently the sun shows up in that chart,
Yes.
because that is so revealing to people about what the real point of the relationship is. Very rarely have I seen it be on the 410 axis, which is basically building a home and family together. Very rarely have I seen it on the 17 axis, which is being in a partnership. So often it's been about second eight issues, building resources together, or what kind of work they're going to do together. It really can change your thinking when you see what the purpose is that comes into life when the two of you start working. Because people tend to get kind of misty-eyed. Oh, we're in a relationship. Oh,
Yes.
this is so lovey. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's
Yes.
not a really sweet, lovey Hallmark Channel Lifetime movie relationship. Maybe it's you're making money together. Well, that's different, and then that raises all kinds of power issues.
Absolutely. And I think also, with the Uranus-Saturn square, a lot of us, of course, have been looking at how are relationships changing. And I think there are huge changes going on in the world in terms of relationships. And of course, COVID has changed also how we view relationships and our experiences. So I think we are in a period of time where we're really evolving very rapidly. And expectations of what relationships ought to be about. I mean, it wasn't that long ago where you think that a marriage contract was primarily a business affair. Certainly here in Ireland, it was about the exchange of land or bringing pieces of land together. It was like, well, you've got this piece of land, you're going to marry that person, get that piece of land. So they were very practical, concrete exchanges. And then they became more love affairs. And, now we're going into this very Aquarian time, I think, where really we're looking more at the value of friendships. And over the COVID time, a lot of people were saying, if it wasn't for my friends, how would I have survived this? And so, it's like we're really beginning to value our tribe, our connections with others that aren't necessarily even blood family. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see more and more of the composite charts, where the sun is, where the north node is, and, to look at what is the purpose going forward of these composites, and how are we going to contribute to, the evolution of our planet and our collective through our relationships. And the other thing is also that we are wanting more spiritual connections. People are wanting a soulmate. They're wanting, it's almost like they're thinking, well, if I'm going to do all this hard work and, I'm going to deal with being in close proximity with somebody else, then it needs to be really the person that connects with my soul. Then it makes it worthwhile. So I think that's really where, that's my sense of where we're heading. And I think the composite charts are really going to reflect that.
I am certainly going to watch for that. That is an excellent call for this. I've certainly been seeing that the last year, especially after all of the outer planets plowing their way through Capricorn and changing our sense of security and foundations, I've been watching people simplify and get extremely focused on what their non-negotiables are and giving up a lot of stuff they thought was important. And there's been an online connection culture that has been thriving. Artists continuing to find ways to be together using technology. I've been in a lot of that, and friends meeting regularly using technology. And now that things are opening up a bit and people can go back out in the world a little bit more, um, honestly, I'm watching people have a very different sense of how many people they actually want to have in their lives, like streamline, like, okay, instead of a huge
Absolutely.
tribe of people, a very small, focused, we have similar goals, we have similar values, we're working together as a giant interwoven safety net.
Absolutely. And I think as astrologers, we kind of saw some changes. I mean, I look back to the Pluto-Uranus square. And, I think that was our first kind of opportunity to really shift and change things. And I think as a global community, we didn't do such a great job. And so when it came now to the more recent transits, we're still doing a lot of work. But I think the changes really were starting then. And I think, whilst, when I was talking also about spiritual connections, I think that's the Neptune in Pisces that is the underlying, reminding us we're all interconnected, we're all one, and that our work is one of love and compassion. And that's the kind of almost the underlining note of music behind it all. And then on top of that, there's the more Aquarian energy of, as you described, finding our tribe and having things in common, and really kind of rolling up our sleeves and saying it's time to manifest our ideals. We can't just talk about equality. We've got to create equality. And we can't just worry about our planet and the ozone layer. We've actually got to make changes and do something different. So I think there will be an increasing number, as you describe, of connections based on what we want to contribute to the universe. And I think there are going to be quite radical changes happening over the next 10 years or so.
And I want to go back to the issue of power with Pluto sitting near the end of Capricorn. Power is an ongoing issue in relationships, and it's often the unspoken issue. And I have certainly been observing, particularly since the Uranus-Pluto square, an ongoing realignment of power between masculine and feminine, which I think is ultimately really going to affect how individuals connect with each other.
Yes, I mean, I think, the interesting thing is that I think even the concepts masculine and feminine are going to disappear at some point. I think it's, we've lived in a society that has, kind of institutionalized inequality and, has created inequality based on difference rather than connection based on difference. And I think it's not about getting rid of difference, it's about actually getting rid of inequality. And I agree with you about power. I think power is a huge issue. It's an issue across the board in everything, in gender, in sexuality, in race, in culture, in every aspect of our life. And I think that is, we have to tackle it. We've really avoided it. And to do that, I hope that Pluto in these last degrees of Capricorn will really kind of help us do the work of dredging up everything that we have pushed under the carpet that's been smelling really, really badly in terms of power differentials and power inequalities and institutionalized power inequalities. And that by the time, because I think by the time it goes into Aquarius, that's where we're really going to start doing even more work. But we've got to first dredge it all up. And I think Pluto in Capricorn has been doing the dredging work. It's like going into a river and digging in the mud and pulling it up. And that's a messy, messy, messy job. And it's a very painful job, particularly for anybody who is being oppressed, because that oppression is right there. And it's it's just there. And I think when Pluto goes in Aquarius, my hope is that then we can start clearing it and really do the work towards equality. And I think, in terms of gender, I think we're going to, all of that is going to change, and I certainly think the non-binary movement is already changing that. So I think with astrology, also doing relationship astrology, we are redefining terminology. We are redefining masculine and feminine, and that we have assigned planetary rulers. We have assigned mythologies that are actually very sexist and very racist. And we have traditionally just kept on. And I think this is such a wonderful time because all of that has been challenged. And that gives us all incredible freedom going forward as individuals and in our relationships. So I'm very hopeful.
This is a wonderful summing up. Before we run out of time, I'd like for you to talk about the Relationship and Astrology project, program, certification. Tell listeners about that.
Certainly, I would love to. Thank you for asking. About 4 years ago, Armand Diaz and I set up Relationships and Astrology, and it really came about because Armand had written his wonderful book called Separating Aspects, and we knew each other as colleagues and friends over the years that I knew he was interested in relationship astrology, and so was I. And so we met at one of the many conferences. We just said, hey, do you fancy doing some work together? And we started doing some recordings and posting them on Facebook. And that was about 4 years ago. And then last year, Armand became the director of NCGR, and he was really busy. And we thought, how about, we expanded. And so Dr. Yvonne Smith-Tarnas took over from Armand as the co-director, and we decided together we would set up a whole team of people. We thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a few of us? And so we've got a great team of people at the moment. And we're planning some changes. First of all, this year, Yvonne and I ran a course, which was an introductory course in psychological astrology, a certificate course. It goes on till next December, so people can certainly join term 3. And we're also in the throes of planning a certification course in relationships and astrology. We already ran one a couple of years ago, Armand and I, but this will be more extensive and will be live online so people can participate. And we're also planning a membership program, which we're in the throes of working on. So we've got some wonderful people on board who are doing work. We've got Stormy's going to be doing some work with us. Kate Taylor is doing some work with us. The wonderful Rachel Lang, Kelsey Avalon, and Christopher Renstrom. So at the moment, that's our team. It may increase.
Where can people find you?
They can find us on our website, relationshipsandastrology.com, Facebook, Relationship and Astrology, Instagram, Relationship and Astrology. Also, they can find me on my own website, astrologypsychological.com. And we don't do Twitter a lot, but we're certainly on Instagram and Facebook quite a bit.
Oh, I really appreciate you sharing all of your wide-ranging and passion about this topic. And I suspect I will be wanting to talk to you again, and I hope you will come back.
I would be absolutely delighted, Kathy. It's been a joy talking to you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And for me too. And for everyone else, you can find my forecasts at omtimes.com and at my site, empowermentunlimited.net, which is also the name of my page on Facebook. And on YouTube, it's the Professional Aquarian channel, and patreon.com/Kathy Beal. So pay attention, look at yourself, and whatever's going on in a relationship, always bring it back to yourself. All right. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you again in a couple of weeks.